Okay, well, welcome everyone. Welcome everyone to our webinar. We are going to start our webinar called Decentralized, Smarter and Greener, the European Grid. So I'm very glad that we can have this webinar, even though not in so nice conditions, of course. But at least on a very interesting and exciting topic, which is the topic of the future of the European grid and the grid integration of solar and renewable energy sources. So that's what we will go through in the next hour and a half. Of course, this webinar is also launching our new working group, a new working group of SolarPower Europe on precisely on the same topic, grids and grid integration of solar. So I will start with first short introductory remarks. First, I'm Naomi Chevillard, policy advisor at SolarPower Europe, and I'll be coordinating that grids working group. So I think I will start with first remarks as attendees are joining at the moment. So I wanted to share, to start with, a bit of the vision of where we are going, something that comes from our 2050 study that we released recently in May, a 2050 study where we looked at what could be the energy, where we modeled with the La Parenta University 100% renewable energy scenarios and analyzed a number of things. And I think what we clearly saw in this study is that we're really entering a transformation, even a revolution of the European energy system. We see that electrification of all sectors, of heating, of transport, of industry is increasingly recognized as the most cost-efficient and energy-efficient way to decarbonize, with indirect electrification and hydrogen as a fuel to decarbonize the hard-to-abate sectors. And this electrification comes with an increased penetration of renewables. And among these renewables, we see that it is primarily a solar story, and that with the penetration of renewables, we have more penetration of solar. What we see on the graph is that by 2050, we expect solar to reach at least 48% of the power generation in a laggard scenario, and up to 63% in the leadership scenario. Laggard scenario being basically reaching climate neutrality in 2050 without a 100% renewable energy system, and leadership scenario being a scenario where we reach a 100% renewable energy system and climate neutrality in 2040. So really a change of mindset and a change of structure of the electricity system, and a change that is driven by the growth of distributed PV, in particular in the coming years and in the coming decade that will bring us to 2030. So what do we mean by distributed PV? We mean smaller scale PV that is connected to the distributed system, as well as all the systems, the residential, commercial, and industrial systems that are below 1 megawatt and that are connected often very close to the consumption point. And in October last year, the IEA has released a report called Renewables 2019, where it showed the impressive growth of distributed PV that awaits us in the next decade. With commercial and industrial PV systems, so between 10 kilowatt and 1 megawatt, that should more than triple the current capacity. You can see it on the screen in the middle of the graph. And to show you how this and this is really an impressive trend. So here we see in Europe, but even in the world, and I like this graph because it shows quite well how huge is this growth, we'll add in between 2019 and 2024 almost the same capacity in distributed PV below 1 megawatt as offshore wind at world scale. So that's beyond the numbers themselves. I think this shows clearly which trend we are talking about. This growth is driven by the emergence of new models on the supply of energy and on the generation of energy, models that seek the optimization of energy generation and consumption locally, and also models that involve increasingly the consumer, that it's becoming more active from its initial role of only consuming, but we are now a consumer that is producing its own energy, that is providing demand response, etc. This is driven by regulation. In the clean energy package adopted in 2018, we have for the first time the recognition of the right to self-consume, both individually but also jointly with other self-consumers within a building. And beyond this model, we see that in different countries, we have the emergence of collective self-consumption frameworks, which are jointly acting self-consumers that share energy beyond the border of the building. It's the case in France, where we can share electricity within a 2-kilometer perimeter. In Spain, where we can share electricity between a 500-meter perimeter, and similar schemes are being developed in Italy and Portugal. And we believe that these models are also key in a sector coupling perspective, because we see these models being coupled with the integration of, for example, electric mobility, with the electrification of heat, etc. So I think all of these disruptions really change the way that energy is produced and consumed, and change the way that we should optimize, design and operate the grid. How to do that, that's what we're going to discuss in the next hour. But I think we already know that this will require investments as well as a new vision. Investments that will be investments in power grids, in smart grid technology, we will discuss that. And our 100% Renewable Europe study has shown that we will need between 31 billion euros and 39 billion euros of investment by 2025 only. And a new vision, notably to integrate this local energy consumption, but also to integrate the new sources of flexibility. And here I refer to the increasing development of demand response, the increasing availability of batteries, both connected in the system, connected with solar panels, or through electric mobility, but also green intelligent solar plants, which can provide flexibility thanks to smart plant controller. So how precisely do that, and how to how exactly should we build this grid, and what is our vision? That's what we would like to discuss with you today. So to do that, I have the great pleasure to be in excellent company. So I will briefly introduce our distinguished speakers: Sanjeet, Sanghera, Senior Associate at Bloomberg New Energy Finance; Torsten, Knop, Head of European Regulations and Project at Innogy, and Chair of our future working groups on grids; Mathilde Lallemand, who is team lead at ENTSO-E, the European Association of Transmission System Operators; Andreas Wader, Global Sustainability Director at First Solar; and Tai Cullen, Energy Storage Manager at Solar Century. So to guide you a bit through this 1 hour and a half, we'll have the pleasure to listen to 2 input presentations from Sanji, Sanghera, and from Torsten, Knop. And then we'll move to a panel discussion with our panelists and with you, the participants, on different aspects of the future of the grids, before we tell you a bit more about the way forward for the grids working group. Before moving to the presentation and the discussions, I would like to remind you that you have the possibility to send us questions during the whole presentation. You have in your control panel that you should see on the screen a small window with questions. You can type your question in the question box, click on the send button, and we will receive it and address them in the panel discussion. So without further ado, I think we can move on to the first presentation with Sanjeet Sanghera, who should have the control. Yes.
Hello. All right. So today I want to talk about the decentralized grid. There are many trends unfolding on the power network today. So we're seeing the rise of DC power systems. We're seeing a shift from passive consumption of electricity to more active consumption with the rise of prosumers. We're seeing utilities embrace digital transformation, but the one of the shifts that's probably the most dramatic is this shift towards decentralization. And what I mean by this is a reduction in the scale of generation assets, led largely by PV. So today I'm going to describe what I mean by decentralization. I'm going to try and quantify it. And then lastly, I'm going to identify two of the challenges this causes for grids. So let's talk about economies of scale. I'm going to use a chart which is a bit complex, but I'll build it up slowly. On the x-axis, I've shown different capacities. I've gone from 100 watts to 1 kilowatts, all the way up to 100 gigawatts. It's a log scale. We've also added the description on the top with the scale this capacity actually represents in real terms, whether it's countries or cities or towns. So Bloomberg NEF has a database of over 88,000 power plant projects, and we can plot them here to illustrate how the scale of these technologies compare with one another. So to start, let's look at nuclear. This is the distribution of nuclear power plants in Europe based on their scale, based on the size of those power plants. Most of it's between 1 gigawatt and 10 gigawatts. And that's because this technology inherently has this scale baked into it. That's the most economical way of building these facilities. Next, we would have coal, natural gas. We're still at the gigawatt scale. Hydro, we're getting a little bit smaller now. Offshore wind, further reduction. And by the time you get to wind and solar, we see that we've dropped more than an order of magnitude in power plant size. And these numbers demonstrate where the economy of scales are for each of these technologies, and they're quite different, right? I don't have a chart here for rooftop PV, but you can imagine it's further off to the left even still. Now we can take this data and look at the mix of assets in a given year to see what the scale of power plant, to see which scale of power plant is producing our energy, right? So let's start by looking backwards. We can look at 2012 in Europe, and this was the energy mix in 2012. And when you plot it, this is what you get, right? The average that you see here, which is shown by this purple dashed line, is 900 megawatts, right? So what that means is that the average kilowatt hour of energy produced in Europe in 2012 originated from a power plant of the size 900 megawatts. That's the key point I'm trying to make here. And yes, so there's some power plants that are bigger than that. Typically it's nuclear, and there's power plants that are smaller than that. But the average size where energy was produced was 900 megawatts. And if we go further to today, you see the average has come down a reasonable amount. The purple dotted line is now at 600 megawatts. And if we take our 2019 new energy outlook and fast forward to 2030, we get here, where grid-scale solar, small-scale solar, and wind are bringing the whole average down, and we're down at about 100 megawatts. And going even further to 2050, we get here, where the average power plant energy is produced at a scale of 30 megawatts, right? So this is a 30x smaller from where we were in 2012, a 30 times reduction, right? Which is a fairly dramatic change in terms of the scale of the electricity system. So now, like I've described this trend of decentralization, and I've put some numbers to it. But the question is, so what? What does this really mean for the grid? And so let's start talking about that. This is a neat diagram. It was produced by the University of College Dublin. It's a map of the UK electricity grid as the electron sees it. So the distances shown here are the distances an electron would experience as it moves through the grid. So transmission, which is shown in green, are a bit closer together than normal because they have a shorter electrical distance and impedance, right? And the distribution grid is shown in blue, which is a bit further apart because that's how it would feel for an electron. The other thing you'll notice is that the transmission grid is highly meshed, right? So that's the way it's designed. It's bidirectional flow of power, and it's designed to have a high level of redundancy, where the distribution grid, to a lesser extent, right? There's a bit more radial aspect to it. Now this is simplified. There's distribution grids meshed on top of the transmission, but like this helps you kind of visualize what we're trying to say here. And as we previously saw, the average power plant in 2012 was 900 megawatts, right? And that's kind of a historical precedent, like a historical representative number. And it's gonna drop to 100 by 2030 and 30 megawatts thereafter. So we can start to map where these generators are going to connect onto this grid. And we ran through this for the UK, and this is what we got. So here I've shown the energy mix in 2012 on the far left, and I've connected each of those generators to the voltage I expect that they're connected to today, right? And the green here shows the portion that's transmission. The blue region there shows the portion that's distribution, just like in the previous map. And we've seen that most of the resources are connecting to the transmission grid because they're too large to connect to the lower voltages offered on the distribution grid. And if we go to 2030, there we go. We see a very different mix, right? We see that the distribution grid will have about as much generation as the transmission grid. And this is because the generation is a smaller scale, and it's going to create a lot of challenges for the distribution grid, not only in finding open bays for them to connect, but there are other challenges with visibility of those assets and controls of those assets that can be problematic as well. And this is one such point here, right? And so distribution generation can cause blackout. And so what this shows is that in August 2019, there was a blackout in the UK, which left more than 1 million people without power. And in total, we saw about 2 gigawatts of generation disconnect. And there's a lot to unpack with this event, and some of the work is still ongoing. But one of the elements of this outage was that the disconnection of embedded distributed generation was part of the problem. And we saw that about 500 to 800 megawatts embedded generation disconnected during the blackout. This generation disconnected because it has this oversensitivity issue. Transmission connected generation doesn't have this problem, mostly because they pay for special protection schemes, inter-trip schemes that don't trip in this way. According to National Grid, there's 10.5 gigawatts of embedded generation with this oversensitivity. And by 2030, we estimate that it'll be twice that much. So this highlights the need for stricter grid codes. And I know this can be challenging because it raises the cost of interconnection, but it also creates longevity to the market when we don't have blackouts partially being caused by these types of resources. And a last example that I'll give is here from, this is showing COVID-19's impact. And during COVID-19, we've seen demand reductions quite dramatically, about 11 to 16% in the UK, over 20% in Italy. And when demand is reduced, generation also has to be reduced. But the question is, what generation is going to come offline? Well, it's generally not wind and solar. Often it is the generation that has a higher marginal cost that has to run for a longer period of time. And so what ends up happening is that we see that renewable generation tends to hang on. And as a result, we effectively have a sneak peek of what high integration renewables is going to look like. This summer, COVID-19 has kind of given us that. And with this, the way you can read this chart, you can read it from right to left. So this shows the dispatch on May 23rd. And you can see the true demand was 24.8 gigawatts. And we had 8.9 gigawatts of embedded distributed generation, that's wind and solar. And then the remaining, so we can skip this purple downward flexibility block, but the remaining demand on the grid, on the transmission grid, was 17.8 gigawatts. And that was supplied by a combination of nuclear, gas, and wind. But that mix that was kind of market dispatched was not appropriate. It created issues with congestion and stability. So the system operator took a few actions to redispatch the grid, included shutting down some nuclear from beforehand, bringing up some gas, running pump storage, exporting on the intertie. But the most interesting one is back to this purple one, this downward flexibility. So National Grid actually introduced a new service where they were paying customers to increase demand or reduce kind of embedded generation. And this was administered by the TSO, but it included the dispatch of assets in the DSO's area. And this wasn't cheap either, right? So this shows the cost forecast over the summer, this summer, and we see that compared to last summer, there's a 493 million pound increase, which is a 150% increase. This shows how important flexibility is and how there isn't enough in the grid today. And as a final slide, like, you know, COVID-19 is a temporary situation, but we're going to come to this eventually anyways, where the dispatchable generation is slowly being eroded and we're replacing it with more of this kind of bulk renewable energy, and this need for flexibility rises. So those are two of the challenges. That's all I have for you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sanjeet, for this nice overview. I think it shows perfectly well and very visually what we expect in the system. So now I think we'll go right to the next input presentation. So Torsten Knop, Head of European Regulation and Projects at Innogy, you have the floor to tell us more about the evolution in the distribution grid and of distribution system operators.
Thank you, Naomi. I think Sanjeet's presentation perfectly fits to what the point I would like to make. I haven't really followed it before, but I think it really is one thing links to the other. Yeah, trying to get the next chart here. There we are. We both try to basically implement the energy transition to contribute to it. We all have, I think, the same objectives. We all know the first three ones. We want to have an energy transition that is going for sustainability and carbon neutrality as soon as it's feasible. Because this has to be a success, we also have to do the lowest possible cost. Nobody really wants to endanger security of supply. That's all known. However, I think we've learned in the past few years, and that is also, it's a contribution of solar, that if you don't go for acceptance of technologies and change, you will also not succeed. And the way to acceptance, as far as we are concerned, I think is through participation and through small structures. And I would like to take a closer look at that together with you. That's a general picture of what is a DSO facing. A DSO is facing different challenges. In particular, we have to integrate electric mobility. We have to bring together the completely different situations in rural and in urban areas. We will definitely use more flexibility on a regular as a regular tool, especially for congestion and voltage management. We are facing different kinds of organizations. That's what we take a closer look at, and decentralized generation. But we also have the suitable answers to that, and that is to make grids more observable, more controllable, to make them smart grids. And the tool to achieve that is through digitalization. I'd like to take a closer look at a few of these and have a look at where solar comes in and what DSO grids can do for solar and what solar can do for DSO grids. But less on the level of what we can in particular do for each other, but more what can we build together. That's the basic idea, and that's where what Sanjeet said comes in. I think that in order to structure the energy transition, we have to structure it bottom up through optimized energy systems of different sizes. That is, call it system integration, call it energy system integration. It should be done wherever it's feasible, wherever it makes sense. That means not everywhere, but we'll have completely different sizes. The smallest integrated energy system through different sorts of energy, probably with generation, with consumption, maybe with storage, is the the prosumer, of course. The next level will probably be energy communities, if they're communally organized, or contracting models. And then you go to small DSO grids, through maybe parts of larger DSO grids. And in the end, you continue to national systems and maybe to the overall system. And I think that helps a lot. It helps to reduce complexity, to manage complexity, to make the whole system more manageable, but it also, as I said before, helps to increase participation, and through participation, acceptance of everything. And the interesting thing about solar is not only that it reduces the, as Sanjeet said, the average size of the connected power plant, which then fits into these different energy systems of various sizes, but solar is the only, that wasn't that clear. I think solar is the only generation technology with such a wide spread of different sizes of the power plants. Even with wind, even with small scale water, you don't really have that different size without any effort of the power plants. And that, of course, fits exactly to these optimized energy systems of different sizes. That helps. That helps. First of all, of course, the DSOs that face three different challenges. We have to integrate decentralized volatile generation. That's especially a challenge in rural grids, where generation, of course, is dominating the design of the grid as opposed to urban grids. We have to face, on the other hand, on the consumption side, we have to face a higher coincidence factor, because usually consumption will be more at the same time than it is today, and that is in particular a problem for low voltage grids, where you have that rather very low coincidence factor today. The coincidence factor of almost 1 in the EHV grid, and then you go down, and medium voltage will be something like 65%, but then you have the jump down to 20% or less in the low voltage grid. And if you change only a bit, then you'll need a completely differently configured grid. You need much more capacity, or you need intelligent solutions. And then, of course, there are also new additional loads. That's also part of the energy transition story. We've heard that there will be, from Naomi, well, there will be electricity in heat. There will be electricity, of course, in mobility, and all these together. That's the challenge for the DSO. We can only manage that by bringing it together on a local and regional scale, and not just for electricity, but for all energy carriers. So what we need is these local and regional energy systems of electricity, of gas, of heat, of mobility. And of course, in order to generate them, in order to enable these local and regional systems, you have to have not only consumption and storage, you also have to have generation. And that's where solar comes in, because it can contribute to medium-sized energy systems, it can contribute to small-sized energy systems, it can contribute to the overall system. Then how do we do it? It's all nice saying, okay, yes, solar is probably going to be part of these optimized energy systems, because it's a decentral technology, because it's a technology in the hands of completely different operators, from single citizens to large-scale project corporations, and they want to contribute to these energy systems, and the DSOs also want to do that. But how do we do it? Of course, the DSOs with smart grids, that's what you see here. That's improved observability and controllability of grids. And you need to work together with those. You don't just observe things, but you also have ideas of what's going to happen tomorrow. So you have to work with the people, with the installations connected to your grids, and you also have to work together with them for controllability and for the use of flexibility. But grids and solar is much more than just they supply flexibility and we connect them. It's about building a common vision. It's building this common vision of the integrated energy system at a different size, and then promoting each other's roles and saying, how can I help you to achieve that for our common goal? And that's the next one is the final chart. This, of course, only happens that we work together, not by saying, oh, we want to work together, but by digitalization, but by exchanging information, by exchanging control possibilities, by really integrating the resources in such an energy system so that it can be addressed and that they can share information and that they can interact with each other. And at the same time, same way that digitalization is a prerequisite for smart grids, it's also a prerequisite for these optimized energy systems. And I think that's the way forward. That's what we might perhaps explore in the grids working group of SolarPower Europe, is to say, what's our common goal? Where do we want to go forward with the energy transition? And how can we help each other, both grids, producers, and all other actors? Thank you.
Thank you, Torsten. I think it was a good introduction to the topic and to the topic that will be discussed in our working group. So all very curious to know what we'll discuss. So yeah, a short reminder that we have, you have the possibility to send your questions through using the control panel, as you can see on the screen. I already had one question regarding the slides. So yes, the slides will be sent afterwards, at least most of them. Okay, excellent. So without further ado, I think we can move to our panel discussion and try to discuss a bit deeper on this topic of grids. So as mentioned to you, we have with us Mathilde Lallemand, team lead at ENTSO-E, Andreas Bader, Global Sustainability Director at First Solar, and Tej Köhlen, Energy Storage Manager at Solar Century. So I hope we can all be online. If we can all turn, yes. Our camera's on, great. Excellent. Okay, so maybe I would start. I would like to start with you First Solar, so Andreas and Tej. So both of you work for companies that are solar and co-located solar and storage developers. So I wanted to know a bit for you, your reaction to the presentations, and understand a bit from your perspective, what are the current challenges with grid connection of projects, with grid integration of projects, and how do you see the evolution of these grids in the next 10 years? So maybe starting with Andreas and then moving to you, Tej.
Sure, yeah. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to give a first statement, Naomi, and thanks for the great presentations to Torsten and Sanjeet. I think there were important topics which were covered in these presentations. And just, you know, as a background, I mean, First Solar is active in the developing space and developing and connecting projects, not so much in Europe, but worldwide in other regions as well. However, we are obviously working very, very closely with a number of developers in Europe in different European markets. And so that's where I kind of, you know, use the experience and the talking points I'm presenting today and maybe I can start with one opening remark, which I think will probably be a major topic in the grids working group going forward. I mean, the title is, we're talking about a 2030 European grid. However, the reality and the experience we have is unfortunately that we're not really talking about a European grid. We're talking about a patchwork of national or even regional grid infrastructures, which come with different requirements, which come with different permitting requirements, as well as obviously costs related to interconnection of assets. And that is, you know, probably my opening remark, that, you know, one of the major current challenges, and I'm really drawing from experience from our developing customers in France, Italy, and Spain, relates to the fact that we are really talking about, you know, a patchwork of different regulations, and that the grids are really managed regionally and not cross-regionally in most instances. And there's most of the time in France, Italy, and Spain, a suboptimal coordination on a national level, not to even speak about a European level, of course. So I think the grids are still very much nationalized, which is obviously not in line
issue with the sound, or is it?
I think we lost the sound, but we got the message.
Yes, Andreas, we lost your sound somehow. Okay, maybe it's due to the phone connection. I don't think he can hear us. Okay. I think, well, we'll try to solve this issue with him, but I think the best is now to move maybe to you, Tag, and then we'll come back to Andreas.
Thanks, Naomi. I'm kind of glad he was caught off. He was about to make all the interesting points. I suppose to answer the second question first, and as Sanjeet has mentioned, we've had a glimpse into the future of the grid over the last few months. And interestingly, the pandemic has potentially accelerated the decline of fossil fuels. To quote the Financial Times on the 24th of April, big oil's survival at stake in a world where everything has changed. Bloomberg, 30th of April, renewables are the only winner in historic decline in energy demand, and the Financial Times on the 28th of May, clean power outperforms fossil fuel peers. So the energy mix is changing and will potentially change much quicker now that, according to a report released by the Carbon Tracker, the fossil fuel industry is approaching terminal decline. We need to plan for the future grid today, and there are significant challenges ahead, both financially but also technically. The lack of incentivization around flexibility is something we're going to touch on later on, but it is the greatest challenge we have when it comes to co-located projects, and flexibility, as we know, is critical if we are to continue to replace the incumbent oil and gas generators with renewable energy. Quite simply, without flexibility, cannibalization, market volatility, and mass curtailment, as already proven throughout this pandemic, will become commonplace in the future grid. Completely agree with the points First Solar made that basically when it comes to the integration of current projects, one of the biggest issues is that good sites are normally located in regions of capacity constraints, and not every country has easy to access data to simulate the location of these constraints. Again, most developed countries we operate in have prescribed processes to connect new renewable generators, but there are still issues. The regulation around transmission connected projects in the UK is contradictory. Cross-references between like over 1,000 pages and multiple different documents. And when it comes to energy storage, take Spain, for example, there is still no process to connect energy storage assets.
Thank you, Teg, for this nice overview. So I think while we're trying to get Andreas back on the line, I think nevertheless we had a first view of the different topics that we are talking about when we talk about grids. The fact that energy generation is connected at a lower voltage, the need for flexibility, the need for a European approach on requirements, on procedures, on operation of the grid. So we will try to dig in all of these aspects. Maybe I wanted to start with the first idea that came in your presentations, Sanjeet and Torsten, around this idea of decentralization of the grid, the fact that we have lower voltage generation capacity connected at lower voltage, the fact that we have models where we have generation and consumption connected together and with increased synergy. And before I continue, Andreas, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm not sure what happened. I was kicked out of the line on the video as well as on the telephone, so I'm not sure how much of my intervention you were actually able to listen to. I'm very sorry for that.
No, it happens. It happens. So maybe I'll give you the opportunity to just finish. You were telling us about the difficulty in the European framework, the fact that we do not have mean, that we lack an harmonization in all of the standards, the operation of the grids. And then I think that's where we lost you.
Okay, yeah, sorry for that again. I hope this works better this time. Yeah, as I was mentioning, right? So the challenge ahead for the next, 10 years really is that, next to getting to a point where we really can talk about the European grid and being able to, accommodate interconnection requests in a, transparent and kind of harmonized way across these different, currently regional grids which are managed by the TSOs and the DSOs. Is obviously one aspect which I clearly see as the main challenge for being able to achieve the objectives we are all signed up to in terms of renewable energy deployment targets. And then the second point I wanted to make real quick was just the ability to participate in the ancillary markets, in the ancillary service market. I think this is also an aspect where we see that in some countries, and the example I was given here by a customer of ours in France is obviously that we don't have access to these markets, right? So there is a lack in being able to valorize and monetize on the ability which PV systems, utility scale PV systems bring already per design today, right? To be flexible, to be dispatchable, to be able to do load shifting, and so on and so on. All these aspects are actually not monetized, or it's not possible to monetize them because there simply is no access to these market segments. So I think that is another aspect where I would say a harmonization on the European level to enable developers to play in these markets is certainly also an aspect I would see as one of the challenges for the next couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas, and indeed sorry for the technical issue. Okay, so now if we maybe deep dive into the first topic, as I was saying, the decentralization of the grid, this idea that we have more self-consumption growing in the next decade, a sort of maybe synergy at local level. So maybe a question to Mathilde. You are working for the TSO representatives, and you're seeing all of these changes. Does it mean that it will fundamentally change the way that the energy system works? Will we maybe work, if I speak in a very schematic way, will we have local energy systems that are optimized very locally, and then only some balancing at transmission level? How do you see that, and what do you see that? What do you see from your lenses?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? Yes, I think to answer your question, Naomi, I would be glad to use the slide that I provided, because indeed, so first of all, I would like to thank the panelists for the very interesting insights and presentations. Indeed, there is a clear trend towards decentralization, and somehow it's making our energy and more precisely electricity field shifting a bit. There, ENTSO-E has built a vision for 2030, where we think indeed there is a shift towards more decentralization. That is clear, and we think that the system of tomorrow would be rather a system of systems. So as you said, we can define a system of systems quite differently, but here the idea would be that it would not be, let's say, a combination of independent systems, but rather an interconnected and interoperable systems which talk to each other. In this figure, you see different scales. Indeed, we think in the system of systems, there are different geographical scales, obviously. You will have the European, the national, and the local. And maybe the last decade, all the regulation we had through, for example, all the network codes and guidelines on system operation, balancing, connection, and so on, were very focused on a cross-border integration, how to foster cross-border exchange, how to connect the national systems together. in order, so one of the main trigger and drive was to optimize also the use of the resources between countries through cross-border exchange, and by this also optimize the use of renewable energy sources. So this should be still carried on because the implementation of this regulation is still on the way, but now it must be complemented by another dimension, which would be more vertical, so from national to local scale. And the clean energy package very much brought this into the picture, pushing for more active local scale, prosumers, more TSO-DSO coordination. And this is quite important to have in mind in this view of a system of systems, that we would have, let's say, this horizontal cross-border integration still going on as a backbone for the European grid and system, and which will be complemented by a vertical, so to say, integration at national down to local level, which will bring value. However, ENTSO-E thinks that it cannot bring as much value as it could if it's not connected to the whole system. So when you say local systems, yes, but not independent from the rest. Of course, there could be a level of local optimization. For example, balanced neutral action taken at a level of a local energy community, as Torsten presented, but it should be still part of the global optimization. And this optimization would rely on a physical grid, of course, physical backbone, physical assets, but also on more data exchange, so more measurements, more observability, seamless data exchange, and also market mechanisms. If we take, for example, balancing, so how to produce, how to sustain, to support the grid balancing between demand and generation, so the so-called balancing mechanism, it will change in this picture of a system of systems. It will change in the sense that more assets will be participated. Tomorrow we may have very small assets. It's already on the way, but it should be faster again. More, let's say, more assets participating to the equilibrium of these global systems and valuing services, like, for example, the grid integration study that SolarPower Europe did with First Solar showed that these assets could provide new services. So this is the global picture, how we see a system of systems.
Thank you, Mathilde. So, yeah, so for you, a system of systems means that there is still this layer of transmission system operators. So maybe, I mean, how do you explain, and can you explain a bit the evolution of the role of the distribution system operators in the system in this new system of systems? Because you were mentioning the need to improve DSO-TSO cooperation. What's the role of the DSO for example, in the new market mechanisms that will be developed? Yeah, can you tell us a bit more about that?
So, as we saw in Sanjeet and Torsten presentation, there will be, and there is already, and there will be more and more generation connected to the distribution grid, making the generation assets not sole TSO connected issue, well-connected assets. And that will mean that there will be potentially more synergies between operation perspective, operation methods, operational planning of the grid between TSOs and DSOs. That's already mentioned in the clean energy package, that we may, between TSOs and DSOs, need to enhance operational cooperation for managing the grid, also planning the grid. So in this matter, TSO-DSO cooperation will be key. Also for data exchange, since lots of resources will be also connected to DSO grid, it's very important that visibility on these resources can be shared. And an important, you ask how DSO's role is evolving. From TSO perspective, an important change in the landscape is the fact that DSOs will be market facilitators, will enable these assets to participate to market. So of course, from a TSO perspective, it will be important that these assets can participate to the overall grid and system services, such as balancing, as I quoted in my example. So as to be a market facilitator. And also the clean energy package gives the possibility to DSOs to procure these services. So far it was mainly TSOs procuring congestion management and balancing services. So this will also clearly bring more needs into cooperation for these markets to run smoothly.
Okay, so more cooperation on operational planning, more cooperation on data exchange, and the possibility to procure services for congestion management in distribution grid, I suppose. So now I'd like to give the floor to Torsten, because you're also seeing this transformation on the other side from the distribution grid. Can you share a bit what's your reaction to what's going on and how the DSO works? The DSO role is changing, notably with regard to these local flexibility markets.
Yeah, but it's not from the other side. I think we are all in the same boat. And of course, both all system operators, both TSOs and DSOs are neutral market facilitators and try to enable the market. However, I think we are now also going beyond that, going one step further, where we say we're not only enabling markets, but we are enabling working energy systems. And there's no doubt that we still have to work on cooperation, on interfaces between TSOs and DSOs. However, I think since last year, more and more people also realize that we also have to work on interfaces and cooperation between DSOs of different for different energy carriers. We have to work on the interface between electricity and gas. We have to work on the interface between electricity and heat. We have to work on the interface together with new mobility concepts. I think cooperation and integration and interfaces is much wider than what we did for the last 5 years, just developing TSO, DSO. And that's, for example, where also solar comes in. And Andreas, where also your projects come in. I think we have to work on the interface. If you want to be active, I see the necessity that you're looking for common standards around Europe. I see the need that you say that would make my job much easier than having to address different rules everywhere. We need to find a suitable amount of harmonization there. But I'd also like to work together with you on your capabilities, on your interfaces, on what I can deliver for such projects as a DSO. And I think it's much more about getting together for each of us from our individual roles, promoting a common cause somehow. And maybe as a brief answer also to Andreas, because that's still there's still the question for harmonization. Honestly, will be difficult to harmonize all these connection rules everywhere so that you have everywhere the same thing. I mean, we have 2,800 different DSOs in Europe. We have 27 member states that with different conditions, that will be difficult. However, we are making steps forward. For example, considering flexibility provision, we will hopefully have a new network code on demand response, storage and aggregation that will start to address maybe next year, hopefully, and that will bring common market procedures, common processes, common products, and that may, for example, makes it easier for you to offer the same flexibility with the same IT systems and throughout Europe, to at least to a certain degree. So it's not from now to then everything harmonized, but I think we are together making steps towards harmonization. Mm-hmm. And of course, we can also, just one more sentence, we can use this grid working group to identify what is feasible and what are the necessary steps that bring forward such multinational operators as solar, First Solar, for example, is one.
Mm-hmm. On this question, maybe of harmonization of rules, you were mentioning, and I think it's important, this upcoming network code on distributed flexibility, and that's also a question that came up in the chat. Today, where are we in Europe? Do we have a lot of these experiments where we have local flexibility markets? Do we have enough elements to have a network code on local flexibility and yeah, how to proceed? Is there also work to do to develop new projects and test, demonstrate new local flexibility projects? Maybe Torsten and Mathilde.
So if I may, yeah, indeed, this is one also of the key topic brought in the clean energy package. So So the uptake of distributed flexibility and demand-side response, and the possibility to have a new network code. So on this, for now, ENTSO-E thinks it's a bit premature to speak about new network code if we don't really know what to put there. So we are currently doing a regulatory assessment of what, and I think we'll also share it with the DSOs and the Commission to discuss, and it would be very interesting to widen the discussion to all stakeholders. So what are the key issues that are not addressed today? Because speaking of harmonization of flexibility services, the balancing guideline already gives quite a widened scope, but there will be more to add on the settlement of the use of sub-meter data. For example, are telemetry requirements enough for the uptake of this kind of services at small scale? Do we need more project alignment for congestion management, for example, to settle this product, to qualify assets for different services? So all these questions are now scanned through to understand what's in the current regulation. I think also Andreas has a good point, so it's a bit different question, but around the connection procedures, it's interesting to see that despite the existence of a grid connection code, there are still lots of heterogeneity between countries that may harm the development of new actors and small-scale assets such as solar PV. So indeed, we can see that even when we have the European framework, it may not be enough, and we may need also to amend it and to push it a bit further.
Indeed. Torsten, if you want to react on the last point. Sorry.
Yeah, I think there are different aspects concerning the new network code. I think that, for example, Mathilde, you mentioned the balancing guideline. You could also mention the SOGL or the CACM. And I think they are so specific to TSO needs that it might be a much easier way to go forward with a new network code. However, concerning European rules, yes, there are in the clean energy package. For example, concerning flexibility, you have the provision for in the directive for each member state to incentivize system operators to use flexibility for congestion management, and hopefully they will do that so that this will become a regular procedure. There are also member states have to incentivize, for example, to facilitate the connection of public and private charging points for electric mobility. So there are things where you really, we do, I mean, E.ON Group is active in 8 different member states, where you can go forward to the member states and say, you have an obligation to do this, to facilitate something, to incentivize something, and we have innovative ideas on how this could be done. Unfortunately, there's no such thing as far as I can see, at least not explicitly, in the clean energy package for renewable generation or for solar in particular. And maybe that would also be a point to pick up to say, yes, we see it's not explicitly in there, but we are now recognizing increasingly all the difficulties, and we would like to see this addressed on a member state level and saying what in particular, if you would have had the obligation to facilitate the connection of solar plants, what is the real obstacle here, and what are the real obstacles, and what are the member state specific solutions to bring that forward? It's a pity it's not in the CEP, definitely, but it still is a discussion that we can open and can say, is it similar? What's similar in different member states? What is different in different member states? And how can we basically facilitate that? And what are the experiences of the last few years here?
Mm-hmm. Indeed, yeah. Following the implementation of the new grid connection code that dates from 2018, yeah. So we moved on from the question of the DSOs to specifically the grid connection procedures. We know that there is now European legislation, so the grid connection network codes, and we need to work, as you were saying, as well with member states on that. Andreas, is there anything, would you like to react to this question of grid connection?
I mean, obviously for developers, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I was just making double sure that you can hear me. Okay. Now, obviously, I mean, for grid connection, again, there is not a one-size-fits-all solution. I fully understand and appreciate that, Torsten, absolutely. We need to work on the interfaces, you know, in the regions and in the grids we're operating. I can appreciate that and understand that. It is, but nevertheless, I think, you know, that there's a lot of value to be harvested here. I think if we can work on streamlining and making these grid connection processes easier, because I mean, as we all see on the component side, and we're at the forefront of that, you know, the module costs are decreasing, right? We're following the learning curve. The same is true for all the other VOS components. So the more important, you know, obviously costs related to grid connection to the process there become in making solar PV even more economically attractive, right? So I think that is the major lever we all should keep in mind, that, you know, the cheaper the components get and the better we can deploy, the more important it becomes to have, you know, a grid connection costs under control, right? And I mean, one example which I got here from developing partners in Italy is that this really has already, you know, in case, you know, the connection costs are too high, it really feeds back to the bottom line of the profitability of an asset of the project on the capex side. So I think that is an important thing to keep in mind, that you know, the more we can work on streamlining and making these connection processes easier and also transparent, right? And that's the best example in Spain, how grid connection requests are being awarded or are being, you know, evaluated, you know, making that transparent and accessible to all the parties involved is also, would already be a step forward and would increase the certainty of developing projects in certain member states at the moment. So maybe these are 2 points I can bring forward here.
Thank you, Andres. Yeah, important issue and very immediate issue. This indeed the grid connection in project development that we're all acknowledging at the moment. Maybe if I move back to the question that came up earlier in the discussion, coming back to this question again of flexibility sources. So we talked about markets and how flexibility is procured by different actors, but I would like to just come back on the actual sources of flexibility. There is in the chat some question to you, Sanjeet, regarding the development of these flexibility sources. So both flexibility and as well, let's say what you mentioned during your presentation, the grid connection requirements. How should they integrate new elements to prevent renewable indispatchability, particularly taking into account taking into consideration the inconsistent climate stability for the UK. So if you could, elaborate on these 2 points.
Yeah, sure. So maybe one comment about, because I think this relates to grid codes a little bit as well. Like having low connection costs is an important aspect of making sure that we can reach these targets for renewable integration. But you can get into problems where you've connected a glut of intermittent sources, and now you haven't put in place the network assets to accommodate any of this. And how these costs should be borne, who should be paying for them, like that's a separate conversation. But as far as the need for them is kind of, it's self-evident. And when you do this, like we've seen problems in Australia where you know, you go and connect a whole bunch of solar and they're having issues with frequency response. And so there are, like, we do need to take care of the grid, and the process needs to be highly transparent to make sure that that's where those costs are going. And that way the market isn't that you have like 5 years of great integration and then followed by huge grid issues with frequency response, and then you end up not being able to move forward any longer, right? So we want to make sure this market can continue to grow in the long term. But going back to flexibility, like we think about flexibility along 3 different domains. And so one is the source of flexibility. So, you have you get flexibility from generation assets. You can get flexibility from demand side flexibility. And you can also get flexibility from dedicated storage assets like batteries or pumped hydro. And then these assets can be activated using different levers, right? So traditionally they've been very passive, like they respond to kind of a time of use type of element, but they're shifting more and more to being active price signals where there's system aggregators and there's some sort of, grid relationship with the need of the asset. And there's different timescales for flexibility as well. So you could look out into the seasonal need for flexibility, or you can go right down into the intra-hour need for flexibility. And so, like, what we're seeing is across all timescales, there's insufficient. Like COVID-19 highlighted that. We've had a surge in the need for flexibility. The market doesn't seem to be appropriately valuing this. And so there's a need for it. Dynamics on the grid can change quite rapidly, and you suddenly end up in a situation where there's an enormous need for flexibility and those assets haven't been deployed. And those who have put in the assets make a windfall, and then those who have to go and try and capture afterwards are chasing something that may not last that long. We're also seeing a trend towards flexibility shifting from just being only around generation and say pumped hydro to being across all three domains, so generation, demand, and storage. And I think this is best, right? So when we talk about reliability, like I come from a transmission planning background, and reliability of the grid is a big topic for me. And so you want to make sure you safeguard the grid in the long term. And demand side flexibility can be compromised, as we've seen with COVID-19, where C&I customers weren't always there to be able to offer the flexibility that we had potentially contracted for, right? And you never really expect that your C&I load is going to drop so dramatically. And so we need to have flexibility in many different sources to make sure that we can take care of the grid.
Perfect transition. So new sources, new flexibility sources. We talked about storage and grid intelligent solar. So maybe tagged, you develop a co-located solar and storage project, which could be sources of flexibility. From your perspective, why do we not have massive deployment of solar and storage projects now in Europe, and what is needed to incentivize this?
Yeah, I suppose funding is almost always the biggest challenge for energy storage. And this kind of funding difficulty is built around three things, in my opinion. It's investor confidence, energy market volatility, and effective single buyer market design, which Sanjeet has kind of spoken about. If we're talking about a true co-located PV and storage project with a constrained grid connection, then the only way to truly maximize revenue is to operate the project fully merchant. Any PPA structure that I've seen wrapping up the PV part of the project basically disincentivizes flexibility and diminishes the potential returns for the storage asset. The other option for a co-located PV and storage project is to have a single point of connection, however, with dedicated capacity allocated to both technologies, and potentially separately contracted connections using something like an IDNO depending on the off-taking structure. This allows the PV offtake to be based around the PPA structure, and similarly allows the storage to operate in any market, be that with a PPA floor, which we're seeing a lot of in the UK, or a long-term frequency or reserve market contract, which we're seeing kind of more in Ireland and Italy trialing a new market. The main difficulty with any of these structures is in relation to revenue certainty, especially on a storage project. Financing based on energy market volatility is, according to investors, high risk. I personally don't see it that way. I think, as I previously said, mass market cannibalization, negative pricing, and generation curtailment is guaranteed and has been proven during COVID-19 over the last 2 months. And this is a significant risk to merchant renewable energy generators, even generators already built coming out of contracts. But it's a massive opportunity for co-located projects. Countries, as I mentioned, such as Italy, are designing new markets that counteract this lack of investor confidence by piloting a new reserve market and offer a 3 to 4 year contract. Interestingly, they only require 1,000 hours of availability per year. So it basically acts as a leverage for project debt. So it's, as other panel members have stated, it's about valuing flexibility correctly. And while markets evolve to solve their own problems, there needs to be government and regulation changes to move towards designing pro-renewable and pro-flexibility markets.
Okay, so yeah, better way to value flexibility. Maybe I would like your perspective, Andreas, especially as we had a question in the chat regarding the flexibility from solar. Can you develop on what you meant by the fact that solar is not allowed in balancing and ancillary services? And overall, yeah, what in your view would we need to value this flexibility from solar?
Yeah, I think in terms of making best use of that resource, I mean the current state of the art on the technology side enables solar, especially utility scale solar, to be part of these management mechanisms for flexibility in the grid, right? So and what we as First Solar, and obviously also together with our developing partners are advocating for, is that these requirements, like balancing requirements, like other ancillary services requirements, are being made part of the requirements in the public tenders, right? So that only developers which can offer that as a package are actually able to bid into these tenders and make sure through that. And coming from a sustainability perspective, it's very similar there. We had a very interesting discussion earlier today on making sustainability requirements part of public tenders, so that manufacturers who can offer these services as integrated packages are actually being valorized for the ability to do so, right? So I think this is indeed a lever where we see potential, and where we obviously hope that going forward we will see more and more of these requirements becoming state of the art when it comes to these RFPs, when it comes to these tenders, so that we go beyond the simple put on the market and forget about it approach, but really enable and empower the developers which are working with integrated packages to really participate in these markets. And require that also for the other ones who are bidding into these projects, that the module suppliers, the inverter suppliers, and the suppliers of the system solution are actually required to offer these services, right? I think that is an important point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. Okay, so a mixture of measures.
Just maybe one remark. It's interesting that you both of you, of course, focus on balancing and frequency control, which is more or less the same. And you, of course, you focus on flexibility business models that are there today, and you say, why aren't they working? What could be done differently in order to make them work? But I think we'll see a much wider application of flexibility in the future, especially managing for congestion management and also on a distribution scale. And what I'd like to do together with you is to develop the requirements for making that work for PV as well, in addition to addressing what you are currently seeing as a business model for flexibility, and seeing which future models for flexibility might be there, and what are the requirements for that.
Yes. Bringing us back to the first question on this new local flexibility markets. Everything is connected. So we talked about the sources of flexibility, and interrupt me, Mathilde or Sanjeet, if you want to add something. But we talked about the need to develop sources of flexibility through different ways, new markets, requirements in tenders, requirements in grid connection codes. I would now have a question on what it means for the grid, the power lines as such. we said, or we see that there is a need to invest into the grid development. But is this, if we manage to unlock all of these flexibility sources, how would this, for example, lower the need for investment? How do we take this into account in grid development plans? And overall, what do we need for the remaining part of the investment? On what should we concentrate when we invest in the grid? So maybe Sanjeet and Mathilde, if you want to react to that.
Sure, I can start. So I'll preface this by saying, so I'm a grid planner, so I'm going to have a bias towards building grid, but so I still anticipate that grid investment is going to be is vastly needed, right? So we're looking at integrating globally like 12 terawatts of new generation needed now between now and 2050. It's going to cost an estimated $13 trillion, and based on the analysis that we've done, you almost need about an identical amount, a little bit less, 11 trillion in grid investment to make this all happen, right? And so this is going to be a blend between different types of investment, but we're still going to need wires both at the transmission and distribution level to move this energy around. There's going to be a shift towards in Europe, we've seen specifically that it's harder and harder to build new transmission lines, greenfield projects, right? Like even in places where the project is a slam dunk, we have clean energy we need to get from offshore north of Germany. We need to move it into the load centers in the south. Even in the slam dunk cases, it's really problematic to move these projects forward. It takes a long time. And dynamics change, right? So like you can end up with industry shutting down, and so the projects need to be able to pivot very quickly, and grid projects are not necessarily great at doing that. And so there is a huge market for projects that can be more nimble, and this includes upgrading transmission lines. This includes being able to modulate the flow on transmission lines, and there's some technologies that do that, and I think there'll be space for that. But where solar, I think, has an interesting opportunity, it's one in the flexibility space, and maybe something that we haven't talked about as much is this reactive power capability that, in fact, solar has. So you have these grid tie inverters, and they're actually able to kind of act as a pseudo StatCom and provide reactive power. And these these solar projects are connected right in the communities where we sometimes see deficiencies in reactive power. Cities tend to have a lower power factor, right? And so there's a huge opportunity to be unlocked there as well, where we can mitigate the need for potential transmission lines by using the solar assets that are already there in a more intelligent way.
To complement maybe on this part, yes, indeed, we spoke a lot about frequency ancillary services. So indeed, there is work to do, and it's already on the way with European regulation to widen the scope of who can participate to this frequency ancillary services. As Torsten said, there is a market which will widen itself for congestion management as well at distribution level, and of course reactive power. And I think also it has been quite seen in the COVID-19 crisis that reactive power can be an issue on the grid, and that indeed it's also very important a flexibility service. As to come back to your question, Naomi, on how flexibility is seen as an alternative to grid development, it is absolutely a key question that is also enshrined in the clean energy package, that we need to think about it and how we are going to find alternatives. Could be short-term, temporary, or could be maybe long-term alternatives to grid development. There, ENTSO-E indeed still thinks that the grid, of course, is a backbone at the European level and at national level for the for this energy system, but we would be willing to start a discussion with you on how to consider other types of flexibility sources. It could be smart grid solution, digitalization solution, which would impact the assets. It could be market-based solution. It could be assets such as storage development. That could be an alternative also to grid development, and it's an important element that we need to address with the different stakeholders.
Maybe, for example, ENTSO-E is doing a TYNDP, a 10-year development plan, every 2 years that assesses the need to build the new transmission lines. Is this something that you managed to already integrate into this this assessment that you do?
So this is not done yet completely. We have in the TYNDP scenario some demand-side response potential taken on board, mainly through peak shaving. We also take some hypotheses on volumes of flexible generation in order to take this flexibility issue both from demand and from generation into account. However, the TYNDP will give you grid needs, and these grid needs could be balanced towards, well, this grid solution, sorry, to fulfill a need, could be balanced towards other kind of flexibility solution, and this would be rather in the 10E regulation, in the PCI selection, for example, that could that this could enter into the game. So today we are working on it, but we are very much willing also to widen the discussion with stakeholders on this matter to see what could be feasible in terms of finding alternatives, short-term or long-term, while still restating the importance of investing, as it was said also in the introductions, investing quite still massively into the grid, especially into cross-border interconnectors.
Right. Maybe Torsten, what's your view on that? How do you integrate flexibility in distribution grid planning, and where do you see the priority for investment in the grids?
We have to, because I mean, there are a number of studies, and but how much of the enormous, and I mean the figures Sanjeet quoted of 13 trillion is incredible, but it's true, yeah. How much you can save of that investment by using flexibility in an optimal way, and you really get down if you do that, and if you build an optimal grid instead of a maximum grid, you can reduce depending on the particular situation, but overall you can reduce investment requirements by up to 2/3. DSOs are also required to issue 10-year network development plans on a biannual basis starting next year. That's one result of the clean energy package. I suppose these will look slightly different from the TSO plans because they might not be as detailed, but where it specifies that we must work on TYNDPs and renew them every 2 years, the clean energy package also says we have to take into account, of course, the development of demand and generation. It also says we have to take into account, and it should be part of these plans, how much flexibility we use. So I think flexibility must really enter grid planning, grid construction, and grid operation. But that's a way still to go on the DSO side for all parties. It's not just for flexibility providers, but of course also for DSOs. Integrating it into grid planning might even be the easiest part. Integrating it into distribution system operation is more challenging. But that's part of the way we should go together and see what are the requirements of solar, what are the requirements of DSOs, and how do we get together with all the other actors.
Yeah, I mean, you touched upon my next question. Indeed, Sanji, during your presentation, you showed the cost of flexibility, that were the increased cost for flexibility currently due to the lockdown and the change of the higher penetration of solar and renewables in the energy mix. How do you see this evolving? Is there a chance to have a more efficient energy system? Yeah.
Like I think there's an interesting question about whether this increased reliance on flexibility is going to come at a higher cost, right, to the energy system as a whole. And like the way I think about this is relative to, so is it going to have more cost relative to not having any flexibility? Well, of course, right? But this isn't really an option, right? And so we have to have flexibility on the system. Reliability would suffer otherwise. We'd end up with price volatility. And so what about relative to the old way of doing things, right? Where we didn't have this kind of explicit disentangled flexibility concept. It was kind of embedded inside of the existing generation fleet. Is it going to be more expensive than that? And that's honestly a very interesting question. I don't think enough research has been done on this, whether the future system is actually least cost when you include grid, when you include all of the assets that are now kind of being unbundled and separated out, as opposed to whereas previously, like, flexibility has always existed, right? We've always been able to ramp output of a facility. We've been able to track demand, but I think it's the volatility is increasing quite rapidly, and then the ability to dispatch generation flexibility has diminished, right? And so then you end up with kind of a different problem. In most cases, I think you end up with flexibility additions, reducing costs. But when you look at it at a total system perspective, it's not necessarily clear whether we're going towards a system that's in aggregate lower cost. But one thing I think that's important is we are going towards a system that's lower carbon, right? And that's kind of the real objective of all of this. And so whether it's lower cost or not is in some ways irrelevant. I think it's more a question of, is it technically feasible and is it lower carbon?
Yeah, but in order to make it a success story, we have to make it at least cost possible. I think the net zero goal, whenever it will come, is a common objective, but it will only be a success story if we don't spend more than we have to.
I kind of think it's going to come down to doing it on. Sorry, excuse me, Naomi. I think it's going to come down to doing it on time and not after it's required. You know, we've seen massive costs associated over the downward flexibility in the last couple of months. You know, even over the last 6 months, storage capex has decreased by about 30% over the last 6 months. Renewables are currently the cheapest form of new build generation and getting very close to a new build renewable energy generator being cheaper than the OPEX for fossil fuel generators. So there probably will be an additional cost to flexibility, but I'm not sure if the whole system cost is going to be greater. And I agree, I don't think there's enough data out there or enough analysis done to actually come to a conclusion on that one.
Indeed. Yeah, interesting question, indeed, which we'll continue to explore. I think we already have some studies. I think Innogy already have some studies, so we'll be sure to reflect them in our work in the working group. We are unfortunately reaching the end of this webinar, and I think we have a nice program to reflect on and a lot of things to discuss. Maybe Andreas, if you want to add anything to what just said.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just as a closing remark, I'm certainly looking forward to support the working group here and, you know, address some of the points, Torsten, you mentioned, but also Tad and Mathilde. I think that there are, you know, a couple of good, you know, leads here, which we should jointly follow and proceed to bring the industry forward. And again, I mean, Tad, as you just said, right, we shouldn't react to regulation, but we should rather be proactively developing the solution here. And I think given that we're all aiming to make solar PV as cost effective as possible, yeah, looking forward to work with all of you in the coming months in this working group and work stream of SolarPower Europe.
Great, so that's a perfect transition. Thank you for your words. Indeed, if I manage to come back to the right slide, that's a good transition to the launch of our great working group, which we mentioned and which is launched today. So our objective will indeed be to work on concrete proposal for Europe's future electricity grids, looking at best practices, what has happened in different countries, looking also at technical solutions, what you just mentioned, Andreas. We'll formulate as well policy recommendations on different files. So, for example, a 10E regulation, but many others. We talked about the network code, for example. And we'll also aim at creating a dialogue with grid operators and EU policymakers on within relevant institutions. So, for example, ENTSO-E or the upcoming EU DSO body. So on that, I can thank you all. We have and invite you to join us in upcoming webinars that we organize, in particular the Global Solar Market Outlook launch, which will happen on the 16th of June. and where we'll look a bit at what the solar market looks like in the next 3 to 5 years, and it will notably look at the effect of COVID. And I also invite you to join us in our EU Sustainable Energy Week sessions on the renovation wave, as well as on the future of the solar and wind industrial manufacturing base in the Green Deal. And of course, yeah, you can join us in all of our online activities, webinars, podcasts, etc. But on that, I would like to thank you all again, my dear speakers, for your valuable inputs. It's only the start of the conversation, so we look forward to continue it with you. And I wish you all a really nice day.
Thanks, Naomi. Thank you.
Thanks for the
Naomi.
opportunity.
Thank you
Bye.
all.
Looking forward to the working group.